Hey everyone, I'm Harnit Singh. I'm a product manager with P0 Security, and today we're joined by cloud experts to talk about latest trends in identity from cloud to the workloads. So to begin with, I'd like each of our experts to just talk a little bit about who they are, what they've been up to in the past couple of years, and just give a little bit of history of what you've been up to. So I'll kick it off to maybe you, Kat.
Thanks, Harnan. Thanks for having me. My name is Kat Traxler. I'm the principal security researcher at Vectra AI. And most recently, my research has been focused on non-human identities, specifically those non-human identities that cloud service providers operate. Not necessarily the ones that you can configure your workloads for, but the ones that the cloud providers are configuring their workloads for and how we can interact with them.
NHIs is a pretty hot topic right now, so we'll put a pin in that. We'll come back to it, have you go a little bit deeper. But thank you. Welcome, Kat. James, you want to go next?
Sure. Hello. I was a cloud security, Kubernetes security guy, and then I did AppSec stuff at PagerDuty, ReliaQuest, some other places. And recently I started Latio Tech as a way to try to help engineers find different security tools. So that's most of what I do now.
Awesome. Welcome. Srajan, you're up next.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm into security engineering at Dave. I lead the ProdSec, AppSec, and mostly work on the cloud security side. I do work on mostly on the identities on the cloud side and on the human side as well.
Oh, very cool. Welcome. And Rami.
Awesome. Hi, folks. Thanks for having me. I am a past and future cloud security person, having spent a lot of time in previous roles building that lifecycle scaling cloud security programs. Obviously, identity comes into play there. In the past year or so, I've been enjoying some fun employment where I have spent some time advising startups and writing, speaking fairly prolifically, along with friends such as TLDRSec and Clint Gibbler, venture and security, done some work with James. So been spending a lot of time thinking and talking about security recently and excited to do more of the same today.
Awesome. Welcome. I'm glad all of you could join. So we'll jump right into it. I think the first thing we want to talk about when we talk about trends is just what we're seeing in terms of threats and issues in the space. So, Kat, you've been doing a lot of research recently. So, can you talk a little bit about the sort of threats and issues that you were seeing in your research?
Of course. Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd love to highlight some research that I unveiled a couple months ago at the Forward CloudSec conference in Brussels. That focused around, as I said, non-human identities and the non-human identities that Google Cloud operates. They call them service agents as opposed to the service accounts or the customer managed service accounts that you can operate. And the research was really focused around this issue of transitive access abuse, where as a user in Google Cloud, as a customer, can I manipulate those service agents in Google Cloud? They're sort of, billed to us as benign agents, benign identities that are operating kind of in the background. But my research focused on methods to manipulate them, to do things like data exfiltration. So that's been the core of my research is, the broad brush of transitive access, where if I have access to a service, what additional do I have additional access to what that service's identity might have access to?
Got it. So, as an example, like one of the things that we see in Google Cloud is you've got multiple projects. So you could have your identity in one account. You could take on an identity of another non-human or service account or service principal in another project, take on the policies that they have already been provisioned with, and then take action on that behalf, on their behalf.
So what you're describing is a managed transitive access where, as a user, you can impersonate, say, a service account, and that can happen across project or within the same project. And that's managed with IAM permissions, and that's a known threat. That's a known threat that can be audited and managed, reasoned about. It's a risk that you can mitigate by creating alerts and having a principal of least privilege. What I've been focused on is a little bit more of a stickier problem, the unmanaged transitive access, where, your scenario was, I could impersonate a service account and take on their permissions. Well, what if there's a service account that you can actually use those permissions that it has by proxy, say by manipulating the service? The very example that I used in September when I released a vulnerability was with a service called Document AI. What happened there was you could spin up a job, basically a background job, a background task, and you could tell it to go ahead and retrieve some input from one bucket and write the output to another bucket. That background task was not done by you. That background task was performed by a non-human identity. And it turns out you didn't have to have the permissions on the buckets. All you had to do was have the ability to create this batch process. So this is an example of unmanageable, honestly, transitive access abuse between humans and non-human identities.
Got it. Got it. That helps a lot. Thank you, Kat. So now James, I'm going to pivot to you a little bit with the talk that Kat just had us go through. Are you seeing something similar when cloud security engineers or CISOs come to you and talk about their landscape? Is it in line with what the latest research is also showing up or digging up, or are they still focused on different elements?
I don't think anyone has accused CISOs of focusing too much on the correct risks at organizations, but I do think identity is sort of all over the place, and that's what makes it so confusing for people in leadership right now. Where when I go and look for help with identities, there's 3 different personas or even 4 different personas that are really involved in it, and it makes it really complicated. The one that's sort of to the side is like IT operations, like SaaS, who has access to what SaaS providers, like that's one bucket of identity. And then within cloud, you have the cloud permissioning, like what Kat's talking about at a very detailed level, where this is where like a CSPM in theory should tell you about these kinds of transitive things, but they're not going to because they tend to like identity as an afterthought. But that's one layer is like the cloud security side. And then you've got Kubernetes permissioning on the DevOps side. Then you have like workload application permissioning on the application side. And there's no single tool that bridges all of those gaps. And what I tend to see more, unfortunately, is that people get very fixated on the one thing that's their thing to know about, which isn't unfortunate from the engineer standpoint. That's what you want. Like you want a cloud security engineer that's doing research into in-depth transitive access issues. You want your DevOps team to care about Kubernetes RBAC, those sorts of things. But at the CISO level, it can get very confusing because they're looking for like an identity posture tool or something to like broker access to workloads or something to manage employee access to SaaS. Like it's sort of all over the place. And that's what makes it such a confusing market for people who are just trying to get an idea of like, what are the biggest risks to my organization? It's super unclear because it really, what a vendor is going to show you is dependent on sort of where they've built their tooling around it.
That helps. It also is pretty scary. So we have the landscape. We've got a set of threats that maybe the vendors may not be looking at and the CISOs may not be looking at. So Rami, I'm going to jump over to you. Maybe talk about how do we go solve this, right? How do we go fix this? If there are recommendations around a governance framework, where would you begin?
Yeah, I think I get the interesting side of this. Like, as James said, every CISO has maybe a slice of this problem they see. And I certainly in past roles have tackled subsets of this. I know folks on this call have as well. I love that you started from governance because I think where we have fallen down at times with fixing identity as security practitioners and where our impulses are good, but our outcomes have been bad recently, in my opinion, is that we're really focused on trying to engineer a solution when we only control part of the system. So you see these approaches that are looking to automate your way out of this problem, or that are potentially looking to bring in a tool to manage non-human identities or to do just-in-time access on the human side. Uh, the problem with identity is that it spans systems, it spans cloud providers, it spans your SaaS providers, it spans your IDP with humans. And especially as you get deeper into some of these cloud providers, as Kat mentioned, as you get into your SaaS software, as you get into legacy parts of your business, you can't actually interoperate with these systems in an automated way at times. They don't offer APIs, they don't offer visibility. And so, for many reasons, I feel that the answer is enabled by a technology and engineering approach. Obviously, we want building guardrails, we want to chase least privilege in an automated way. But fundamentally, it has to be an approach of governance. And this is where I think there's been an interesting life cycle of attention paid to identity. I think human identity popped for a while, machine identity popped for a while. Now we're talking about non-human identities. To some extent, these are all part of the same story, just at different scales and maybe with slightly different contexts. And so I think from my perspective, when I've looked at identity governance, it's been really important to do my best to break through those silos that James mentioned and look at the problem as a whole so that I can focus my effort where there's the most risk in a given moment, which maybe it's with my non-human identities, maybe it's with secrets for my SaaS providers, maybe it's with humans touching prod, which is a talk I've given and a hobby horse of mine. And I think like this connection between like how do we fix human, how do we fix non-human, like non-human identity as a buzzword is where I punt to Srajan here because he wrote a blog post I really enjoyed about maybe this non-human identity trend and how it ties into these other parts of what we've already been doing. So like Srajan, if you want to speak to that at all, I would give you the floor.
Yeah, thanks. I think the biggest difference between human and non-human identities is that non-human identities are not fishable, right? We humans are. Um, but they can be misconfigured. And the velocity at which, the non-human identities or machine identities are growing, it's pretty much 50 to 1. And with this velocity, as they're growing, the chances for them being misconfigured is like very high and very often. That's why the space is very challenging to solve. But I think the fundamentals of IAM management or like identity management or governance of these is pretty much the same, at least for me. Same that what we apply for human identities should be applied to non-human identities as well. And that's where I think we don't really apply those principles, like principles of zero trust or, least privilege. I mean, we apply those to human identities, but let's say we create a new service account or an API key, which has, overprivileged access. We don't do access reviews for those. But we do in the compliance, we have to do periodic access reviews for humans, but we don't do access reviews for service accounts that we have created or API keys or whatever. So I think that's where uh, the problem grows. Like it gets accumulated, and now because we are all talking about NHIs, now we want to go back and solve this NHI problem. And because we haven't really paid attention from the start, that's where we look over to these new tools who pretty much will give you an inventory, right? And then, but that's not going to help if we don't have a process, if we don't have clear guidelines, if we don't have how to replace a token or how to replace a service account or how to reduce the privilege of that service account. If we don't have all of these processes set, I think just buying a tool probably wouldn't really take us too far.
That makes
I,
sense.
I
And then,
want to yes and you here before Harnett jumps in and keeps us moving along because I think something you talked about there is like we have to do the same thing we did for human identity prompts two thoughts in me, right? The first is that actually these are tightly intertwined because often non-human identities are used as part of human processes. Like, Kat mentioned a case where you're using a service that has a non-human identity. Certainly, we all in security have used administrative tools where you click a button and it suddenly uses its highly privileged role to do something more safely. So you can't look at machine identity in a bubble or human identity in a bubble. You need to get that baseline capability in place to map these transitive accesses. You need the like context on humans from your IDP. You need resource context from your cloud provider or your SaaS or your data platform. And then also, I want to say that like we did this for humans doesn't resonate with me necessarily. I think we still see tons of issues with human identity. Um, I think that you also shouldn't do too much here. This pursuit of absolute least privilege slows down the business at times. And so there is some sort of balancing point with limiting permissions to the point you limit risk without limiting permissions to the point we're back in the world where teams have to send in a ticket to security to add a permission one at a time with a guess and check method. Like there is some balance here. And so yeah, I think like transitive access means you need the full picture. And I agree, these are all shades of the same problem, but to me, that's like all the more a message that we need the right data and context in place to then slowly make well-informed decisions.
I think you brought up a good point. In terms of standing access, there's oftentimes even humans get, like I would imagine, and James can probably correct me, you end up with a cluster role for K8s, right? You want to do your work, you don't want to get specific permissions to a single pod, so you'll go ask for a cluster role and be able to do everything. And that's exactly the point that Strajan brought up, which was, hey, we're going to give standing high privileges to these accounts, which are non-humans, which can potentially do a lot of work. So if you have a Terraform script or something, you'll end up giving it maybe cluster role to go do a lot of stuff in K8s, but you never go about deprovisioning that. So what's the right balance to strike there is to a good set of standing privileges and good ones to go then escalate from. So has something changed then recently? I know, Shrajan, in your blog, you pointed out that we've had NHIs for a long time, right? We've had machines that have been doing cron jobs and doing work even with legacy systems now. So in the early 90s, we've had this. So what's changed now, right? Is it just the number of accounts that have changed, the proliferation, or the combination with cloud? What's going on?
Yeah, I think you call it right. The number and the one thing that I mentioned in the previous statement is the velocity, like the speed that they're growing with our current development. Like the infrastructure is growing with exponential speed. And with that, even the scale of these NHIs or the non-human entities has been growing rapidly. So how do we control them? How do we monitor them? That I think has been a bit lacking in terms of, why this has been coming up as a new area or a new thing or a new threat that we all need to look at. So I think that's where, we need to focus more on, is that how can we apply the same principles of human identities or access reviews or overprivileged lookup? So how can we apply all of these to these new NHIs that we are spinning up? The only thing that I see different is like the scale at which they are growing.
Mhm.
I do think it's worth adding that for some of the emerging technologies, like there's just no defined best access pattern compared to like a Windows server. It was like, oh, I got my AD system like added to groups. Oh, group based access for AD, amazing, we did it. But like I could have a full on argument with anyone about if Kubernetes Secrets Manager, Vault, fetching secrets directly from the API, using Secrets Manager, using like some janky custom S3 script, like all of these are valid ways to do secrets management, and it's very unclear like which is the best way. Like you could sit and debate the pros and cons of each approach, but the closer in my opinion that we get to like app security, just the more debatable it becomes and the harder it gets to like have these distributed management systems that aren't all just tied into the Active Directory behemoth that we all hate.
And I think you bring up a good point of that there has to be privilege that exists at some point, right? I mean, pulling secrets from Secret Manager might be considered a privileged um, permission. But it's part of it's part of a task that has to be done. Privilege has to happen. We can't least privilege our way out of this problem. There's a certain amount of cruft to be cut with least privilege, but at the end of the day, we have to learn how to manage it in a different way. Um, and that's where things like just-in-time access come up. That's where things like detection for anomalous behavior comes up, and also kind of a not thought of remediation or tactic is just reducing the blast radius, understanding your threat model and saying, well, this is going to get compromised. This privileged action, this privileged identity is going to get compromised. When it does, how bad is it going to be? And can we reduce that blast radius through other containers? I use that word loosely, not an actual container, but boundaries, should I say?
That is
Yeah,
a
I think that's
oh, go ahead.
interesting. It like ties into how folks are architecting for multi-tenancy, right? It is like similarly, we have global identity multi-tenancy. And so to some extent, you have to think about like transitive access is about identity neighbors to some extent. And so you have some of these same models. And I think what I found, and maybe James could speak better than I could on this, it's not my area of expertise at all, but like when you start looking at Kubernetes, one of the things that comes up is you now have an IAM system inside your cloud IAM system. If you go multi-cluster, you have multiple identical but distinctly bound identity systems in your cloud identity system. And that has trade-offs, right? Like, do you have the tooling and expertise and ability to manage that fractal pattern and to gain observability? Like, do you have more management and governance capability to let you do that safely? Or do you have more trust in getting it right once in a single, muddled mass of identity permissions? Neither of those is a perfect solution. But yeah, I think like I mentioned James because James is who I talk to when I want to talk Kubernetes. But I do think there is something there where Kubernetes reflects the identity plane in its own unique and special way, and then has all these problems you already mentioned around federating out further into your environment with, secrets management or vaulting.
Yeah, I was really helped by a Reddit thread of DevOps people arguing about using Vault versus Secrets Manager, because I always felt like I was crazy and not knowing like Vault mounts another drive to your pod that stays there. That seems not great. But Secrets Manager that gives that pod permanent access to the secrets it needs. That also seems not great. And it stores it in, like, both are stored in memory. Should you write app code that deletes keys after they're accessed right after? Like, you could. Is that a meaningful security improvement? Kinda. And so that's where it all gets just very muddy compared to like, and I think what's tempting for me and for all security people is to get super into the details, which is why that cloud sec idea fails of like perfect least privilege permissioning. Because yes, you could baseline every single identity and account, get its most commonly used permissions, create like per user policies that are exactly granular and need just-in-time approval whenever they escalate. But that's not like a good workflow for people, to constantly be like asking security if they can, oh, I read this file from an S3 bucket. Can I read this one now? And so there has to be some higher level planning, separate from the details. And I think that's what makes it so hard to tackle.
Yeah, I would say also that if we were to create that utopia that you described, I'll call it air quotes utopia, where everything is starts with no permissions, and you have to beg Peter and borrow from Paul to get every last little permission in some just-in-time fashion, because you enumerated all of the possible ways. There's still going to be risk that you actually can't enumerate with those unmanaged transitive access patterns. So this idea that we could possibly audit it all and have it in some big super system that we can map out is just false. So even though it brings us some warm and fuzzies to think that we could least privilege our way down to perfect, it's never going to get there, in my opinion.
Let's Kat, can I ask what you think about like the permissions boundary approach that I see more and more stuff coming up about? That's like, instead, what if we define the permissions that we know that nobody should be using, and thought of
Yeah.
least privilege more along those lines?
So what I keep coming back to is the threat model of using the CSP managed non-human identities. And the risk there is really the combination of the permissions assigned to that non-human identity. And that's not managed by you, that's managed by the CSP. Again, these are background tasks that should be innocuous. It's a combination of those permissions, often privileged, with the ever-evolving, changing functionality of the service. So if you have this perfect blend of service functionality that can be abused to manipulate these permissions um, that should not be abusable, then you have that perfect storm of unmanaged transitive access. So in your case, having permission boundaries does nothing for this.
I would jump in as someone who has like written the classic blog post on, turning off services you don't use at the permissions layer. I think it's many people have written one. Something that comes up for me is the risk lies with your data and resources, and your data and resources inherently require some level of access. And so this is like most useful against vulnerabilities that don't impact any data or resources you use, which in an environment of a reasonable size sort of really limits the value because attackers want to get at the data in your S3 buckets. They want to use Amazon Bedrock for LLM jacking, and they want to spin up a whole bunch of cheap compute and mine cryptocurrency. And you can't turn off those APIs. And so, like, you do reduce your risk. I think it is an easy win to turn off. Google does this by default. Like it's opt-in for many services. I think credit where credit is due for providers who don't do that, making sure you have a sort of opt-in, not opt-out model for service consumption through controls like SCPs and AWS. It's worthwhile. It doesn't make me feel better about my identities and my non-human identity risk because those are so tied into things I actually have a reasonable, like Kat mentioned, that people will need to access them. And so unfortunately, those blanket controls on permission boundaries are less exciting on that front. I think there's no getting out of this being a challenging problem that you just have to dig in on and be very thoughtful about like making gains in inches and not losing them.
I think it's worth adding that there has to be some level of privilege or some level of privilege to exist for the business to work, right? But I think what exactly has worked is if you want to limit down a bit of access is attribute-based access or an ephemeral accesses. So for example, a resource, there's an object in your S3 bucket that you mentioned. That's an object, and having an attribute that only, let's say, from the marketing team would be able to access it. And then whoever is in that group, or it can be either human, it can be non-human, is able to, now we are adding that person or identity into that group, should be only able to access that specific object. And if it can be a little bit of time constraint, like make it expire maybe 12 hours or whatever, that kind of reduces the attack surface to some degree. And that can be, we can put this across different resources. It doesn't have to be just cloud. It can be your SaaS applications, your cloud, any other applications.
That's a good point. That's actually what I wanted to get your parting thoughts on. So I'd love for each of you to talk about maybe a 2-minute snippet on best practices for cloud security, right? Where would you start? I think you've already given really good pieces, but what's a good way of starting there? And then how do you achieve the Holy Grail, which doesn't sound like it's possible. The utopia may not be achievable, but how do we get close to it? So
Okay.
Shrajan, since you're already off mute, why don't you start?
Yeah, I'll take it. I think just want to reiterate my original thoughts. Have a process set up. Start small. Partner with the teams that close to you who can be your initial who can have a buy-in for this idea of identity management. Not everyone would right away start with it. If we start with hey, with some developer team and ask them, hey, why don't you come, we want to do an inventory of all our Kubernetes service accounts or resources there. Probably may not be the best idea. We if you're not doing right now, you probably would have to set up the process first, make the inventory, see what are the overprivileged or privileged accounts, not just overprivileged, and see if they're still being used, if there is any lingering account, both human and non-human. I think setting those up would I would suggest like I would go by that. And I think at this stage, having just-in-time access is like by default. I don't think it needs an exception right now, but there has to be a balance. Like we cannot have like I think James mentioned, you cannot go about adding every permission and ask from security, hey, can you approve this? There has to be a balance where devs don't face a lot of friction in that and have a process, have a break glass process where in case of firefighting, you know, we want to solve those kind of incidents and devs can easily access some high privilege. Um,
Awesome. Thanks, Rajan. James.
Yep. I it's hard because as Srajan was sharing all those things, I could think of different vendors that like their whole pitch is solving one of those problems that he's listing out, where it's like, we use AI to do approval so you don't get overwhelmed in approval requests, or we do contextual authorization so you don't have to worry about the authorization. Like there, so the vendor noise is a lot out there. But as far as actually solving the problem, I think the main thing is first trying to have empathy around authentication and knowing that like it is very hard. I think it's the hardest part of security. It's super difficult, and the more that we can stop acting like, oh, we're all mega 10x Chad developers or whatever, like no, like this is really complicated, difficult stuff. It's okay. And then to get time from a CISO to understand like an identity project is going to take time to like fully shadow developers to understand end to end their concerns and how they're currently accessing things. This is like nobody wants to touch this because they're too afraid to break it. And that's going to require like empathy and time and testing and cross team communications and like a lot of different pieces. So it's more just knowing that like take your time. It's okay to learn stuff along the way with it. You're not going to be able to come in and just say, or at least you shouldn't come in and just say like, hey, here's my favorite open source repo for Okta to AWS stuff. And now here we go. But it's going to be a more time consuming process than that, even if you get the coolest, most expensive vendor along the way.
Just to let you know, I am one of the Chad 10x developers, and I set up a Tomcat instance on in my last company, had it publicly exposed, and in a week we had crypto mining growing on that machine. So clearly, I had everything figured out.
Yes,
But
I have not worked at enough places to be able to share the things that I've done because it would give away too much.
Honestly, I have to admit that I'm more shocked that it took a week. Usually that happens within minutes, but
oh boy. Your thoughts, Kat, then.
hmm. No, none of my recommendations are ever very satisfying because I tend to work on research that doesn't have really easy solutions to them. Most of my recommendations are honestly directed towards the CSPs, because this is the mess that they kind of have to sort. Um, it's challenging them to take a good look at their threat models of the non-human identities that they operate and understand where can they scope or reduce the blast radius for their customers, and where can they implement least privilege. Say if you have a real good understanding of the threat model, perhaps auto assigning permissions isn't the way to go. If you can't sufficiently define the blast radius and limit that to a single tenant or a single project, perhaps opening up the permissions, assigning admin permissions isn't the way to go. So most of the responsibility on cleaning up this mess is from the CSPs, in my perspective.
How do you get them to do anything? Support tickets? How do you go about doing that?
Well, that's my job. I'm their friendly antagonist.
Sounds good. So all queries over to Kat then.
Yes.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kat. And Rami.
You too could have Cat as your friendly antagonist. Just want to Get a big enough target on your back. Yeah, I think like folks have said good things. Where we started talking right at the beginning of this conversation was a lot about how the problem is coming with velocity, right? You have AI agentic workflows and big data warehouses and data lakes, and you have, a proliferation of identities in Kubernetes. You have this huge velocity growth. And so, like Srajan talked about inventory a couple times, which I really like, but I think like you need to start by actually looking at where you are on the velocity curve and accepting that there's a certain predicate investment that needs to be made to make any reasonable approach to identity security. So if you are very, very early and you're getting one new identity a day, sure, a human sitting down and like running a one-time inventory and starting to fix things has value. If you're in a company of reasonable size where you have 10 times or 20 times or 50 times as many non-human identities as employees, you need programmatic inventory and really programmatic risk assessment to get anywhere. And so I'm not gonna, do James's buy 5 vendors and then cry a little approach. But I will say that like you need a story for how you are going to figure out your priorities, figure out your areas of risk. Then I would say I like the framework of ratchets and levers for doing security work. Ratchets are one-way doors that meaningfully increase your security bar and are sort of bulwarks for further gains. So, for example, we talked about permission boundaries here in various forms. Those could be a really good ratchet where early on you remove some of the non-essential risk of services and permissions that you don't use at all. Another example is just-in-time access that Srajan mentioned, right? If you go from standing access to just-in-time access, you can roll back that decision, but you really should only make it when you're confident that you as an organization can support developers and their needs. And going forward, you have now set a new standard that meaningfully changes your security posture. Levers are then like opportunities to get a lot of gain for little investment. An example I'd give here is when I was in previous roles looking at AWS IAM, I found that I think it was 80% of overprivileging by permission. So if you looked at every permission that was unused in our entire estate, we're all tied to a deprecated default managed role that did not get automatically migrated, right? It was something that was set up by AWS in the good old days that had every permission under the sun. We had used it in a bunch of places. We never stopped using it. AWS was now on version 6. And just by improving that role, I removed, 80% of these extraneous permissions. And so that's an opportunity where like small changes, big impact. With non-human identities, I'd actually say that lifecycle management is the root of most real-world initial access vectors around them. Non-human identities make bad breaches worse, but the real times you see them be the initial root cause is when you have, oh, we forgot we had that key there. Oh, we don't use that vendor anymore. Oh, we failed to rotate those things. And so I think that like if you were going to get one thing right pretty early, once you had visibility, I would think about lifecycle management because you can get a lot of leverage out of removing access that is not being used. And especially if it is a whole SaaS vendor, a whole admin permission into your cloud from a third party, a whole connector between your multi-cloud environment. Those are opportunities to look for. And the last thing I'd say is like, I think we've all acknowledged this is a hard problem. If you're working on this, you are not doing it alone. What's been nice about this non-human identity boom, is there's been a lot more discussion and a lot more work being done. We should continue to do it. I think this is a hard problem, but it's one that you can actually meaningfully reduce risk while not getting it perfect. And in security, you have to get really comfortable with that because that's sort of the whole job is finding ways to reduce risk while accepting that you'll never have perfect security. So that's my take.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. I learned a lot. I am relatively new to security, so having this expertise was really helpful for me and hopefully for the listeners as well. So thank you again, and that's it from us. Take care. Bye.